event with the assistance of my colleagues, Lisa Knowlton, Victoria Nabolson, and with the assistance of Stephen Spratt and Xavier Danton at Paula Cooper Gallery. And thank you to the people at New Directions for publishing all the beautiful Pessoa and just everything else you do. It's a pleasure to welcome Patricio Ferrari, who I met 4 years ago around the corner at Torn Page by Leanne Brown and Tony Torn. But Patricio is here to translate his translation of Fernando Pessoa's The Complete Works of Álvaro de Campos. Patricio is a polyglot poet, literary translator, and editor born in Argentina to Italian immigrants. As a translator, literary editor, Patricio has published 20 works, including The Galloping Hour, French Poems by Alejandro Pizarnik, The Complete Works of Alberto Cairo by Pessoa, both with New Directions, and Habla Terrena. I have gringo Spanish, I'm sorry, by Frank Stanford. His works have been featured in the New Yorker, the Paris Review, and the New York Review of Books, among others. He just completed Mud, the first volume of his Else Here multilingual poetry trilogy. Patricio's interlocutor is Dr. Maya C. Popa, who is the author of Wound is the Origin of Wonder by Norton and Picador, and the chapbook Dear Life, which was shortlisted for the Michael Marks Award. Wound is the Origin of Wonder has been featured in the Washington Post, the Harvard Review, Booklist, and elsewhere. Her newsletter, Poetry Today, was named a 2023 Substack featured publication. And although she is not able to attend tonight, Patricio's co-translator is Margaret Jewel Costa, who is the translator of innumerable works from Portuguese and Spanish and Italian into English, many of which we carry here at the bookstore, which are on the shelf or the front desk over there, including Written Lives by Javier Marias, Requiem by Antonio Tabucchi, and most relevant, the Book of Disquiet. For those unfamiliar, Fernando Pessoa was born in 1888 in Lisbon and was a poet, essayist, philosopher, astronomer, publisher, translator, and a writer of fiction. In order to do this, he divided himself into heteronyms, which are not pseudonyms, but entirely different characters with different political opinions, appearances, and philosophies. Of the 81 heteronyms, the three most important were Alberto Cairo, Ricardo Reyes, and Álvaro de Campos, the writer of the present volume. With this necessarily meager summary of Pessoa, who, as Campos writes, is a door to everything, to all of the teeming human universe, I am delighted to present Patricio and Dr. Popa. Before I hand over a few words about tonight's event, you won't get rid of me that easy. The event is being live streamed. It'll be archived at PCG Studio on Paula Cooper Gallery's website. You'll be able to view it there and share it with others. Our speakers will have a 40 to 45-minute conversation, and we'll have a Q&A afterwards. After the Q&A, you can get a signature and choose any of the books by Margaret or Patricio. With that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Pope. It's more for the live stream than for us. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you all for being with us this evening. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to be representing, Patricio in the New Direction book. I have to say that Patricio's knowledge of Pessoa is encyclopedic and delightful, and I'm so thrilled to have the chance to mine his mind in front of this wonderful audience, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions for him, because I think this is, Fernando Pessoa is a writer that, as we said, that sort of brief but insightful introduction deserves a lot more delving into. So with that, I'm hoping that you can start us off just by giving us a sense of Pessoa as a writer, and sort of how this project came to be at this particular moment. And let's start with sort of big, and we'll narrow in as we go.
Thank you so much, Maya. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, 192 folks, for hosting this. Thank you, New Directions, for hosting Pessoa in your home. I'm very, very happy to be doing this and to continue to edit and translate Pessoa. with New Directions, and thank you all for being here, Maya and everyone, Lisa and Terrence, and of course you, Maya, for being here. I'll just start with a few Pessoa quotes, and then slowly walk down the maze, the labyrinth, the universe of Pessoa. Se plural como o universo. Be plural as the universe. Deus não tem unidade. Como a terei eu? God has no unity. How could I have unity? Sejamos múltiplos, mas senhores da nossa multiplicidade. Let us be multiple, but gentlemen of our own multiplicity. Art is dodging, acting, or living. Art is dodging, acting, or living. And Álvaro de Campos, olha, tudo é literatura. Look, everything is literature. Pessoa would not be who Pessoa eventually, slowly, gradually became in terms of this literary machine, this man of letters, distinctive, multilingual, multifaceted letters, if his dad hadn't passed away, if his mother hadn't remarried, and Pessoa at the tender age of 7.5, gone to South Africa, where South Africa at the time, 1895, was under British rule, and the British influence, rule in that sense, was even more present than in England. And by present, I want to say the education that Pessoa received was an education that maybe British people were receiving in England a couple decades prior. So very, very British. And from the get-go, Pessoa is immersed in a completely different world, in a completely different language that had not been part at all of his life. Only other than Portuguese, French was the language that at the time in Portugal, in the Iberian Peninsula, and in Europe was the predominant letter, if you will, the passage obligé, that would last even to the 60s. So Pessoa, in a way, by going to South Africa, gained a language that his contemporaries, so years later, would never acquire. So that in and of itself would set Pessoa apart once he returned to Lisbon in 1905 at the age of 17 and a half, so 10 years later. So Pessoa was equipped also, say, with everything that the Portuguese letters had, because he continued reading in Portuguese in South Africa. He continued learning French and reading in French, plus then all the English of a place that for 10 years, if you will, and place here, I mean the playground, the school, everything that Pessoa would do from then on in terms of thinking and planning would remain in English until the last line that he wrote on his deathbed. I know not what tomorrow will bring. Those are Pessoa's last words on November 29th, 1935. So English remained instrumental for Pessoa, and of course for the heteronymic project, and really for almost everything that he did, even when he wrote in Portuguese. Talk about that, I'm sure, because that is also what set Pessoa apart. Writing in Portuguese with English humming underneath, for this basso continuo of course, of language, of imagery, of literary tradition, of influences. So Pessoa would write with those voices literally in mind as he eventually returned to his mother tongue, which was not immediate. Pessoa, of course, while in South Africa, wrote mostly in English. And when he returns in 1905, for the first 3 or 4 years, he will mostly write in English and French. For those 4 years back, French was the second language of production for Pessoa. And only in 1909, he goes to the university, he drops out. 2 years later, 1909, he begins to, of course, as Pessoa himself, the notion of the heteronyms is not even there, although he had been creating fictitious characters, right, under pseudonyms, and we will talk about that crescendo of complexity. Only 1909, at the age of 21, it's not young, he begins to write poetry in Portuguese, like truly to write poetry in Portuguese. He had been, 5 or 6 or 7, but not really, and certainly not really in terms of quantity.
I think we should move perhaps to the heteronyms and just get sort of having a more, I'd love to hear from you sort of about the main heteronyms and how you kind of see this project and sort of the psychic bifurcation, the linguistic project behind heteronyms, and how he made this entirely of his own genius, and how he see this play out, perhaps even in sort of the historiography of his work, and what this means in terms of how we look at Pessoa as Pessoa, right?
And it is very, very well put. It is a psyche bifurcation. It really, really is. And the complexity of what Pessoa, since an early age, he begins to do. So in 1903, for instance, he wins the Queen Victoria Prize for the best essay. So is 15. They've been in South Africa for a handful of years, but his classmates are their first language is English. And so Pessoa is really writing in ways already that they're different from the average than his peers. And slowly he begins to experiment with names, and not just 1 or 2 or 3, but 10, 15, 20. He creates the proliferation of names begins because Pessoa puts together, when he spends holidays, one summer, he does go back only once in those 10 years to Portugal. He puts together a magazine. So he creates the editor, those who would write the comic strip, those who would write more the news, those who would actually write the poems, those who would write prose fiction. So the proliferation of names, 20, 30, 40 names, happen very, very fast in the first few years within Pessoa's teens. But at the same time, when he returns, he sends a few poems under the name of Charles Robert Anon. He writes a few incendiary, not as incendiary, of course, as Campos, but problematic poems in terms of the political stance that he takes about how the Brits are behaving vis-a-vis the Japanese and the war at the time, at the turn of the century in Japan. So he wants to veil. He sent in his poems at school. He also writes about a teacher under the name of Charles Robert Anon, that should ring a bell, anonymous. So if you will, we go from creating a lot of contributors for a magazine under different names, lots of Portuguese names, to Charles Robert Anon to veil Pessoa's personality or person not to get in trouble. So far, nothing extraordinary, nothing. However, a year later, after Anon writes, and this, of course, as critics and as editors who discover this later, Pessoa begins to do something that, to my knowledge, no other writer until then or since has done, and that is to start attributing books from his own private library to the writers he was slowly beginning to create. So he wants Anon to write a certain type of poetry, a certain type of fiction, and philosophical texts. So what does Anon have to do? He has to read those books, right? As writers, we have to read. And one of the books that he assigned to Anon, it may have really been one of the first ones that where he does this book assignment to his pre-heteronyms, is the selected works of Thomas Chatterton. And Thomas Chatterton, a beloved poet for the Romantic poets, some Keats and Byron, I believe, they wrote either poems or they had Chatterton in epigraphs, created a medieval monk who wrote poetry in medieval English. Now, Chatterton also created the manuscripts in the sense that to look old, to eventually sold them and make money with this. Now, the complexity, it took almost 100 years. I believe it was Dr. Skeets who finally settled the issue that it had been Chatterton and not Thomas Rowley who had written these medieval poems. So but Pessoa knew already to begin with something that was perhaps more complex than just a pseudonym. He assigned this book. When he's back in Lisbon, he begins to create almost his alter ego, born in 88, just like Pessoa. It is the Pessoa polyglot poet Alexander Serge. So it's a grandiose name, right? Alexander Serge. He played with the word seek, then he settled for Alexander Serge. He created business cards, same address as Pessoa's. And with him, but also with Anon earlier, they send letters to England to receive books. So they're corresponding with different publishers. But we go from 3 books in Anon to over 20 in Serge. And Serge was to be a romantic poet. So of course he's going to be the owner of books such as Shelley's works and or biographies by poets that would have really honed his style. And this is what's really interesting. When we read the Serge poems in English, they are not like the poems Pessoa himself was writing. And when we read the influences of those, say, Serge poems, Serge, owner of the complete works by Byron, he is not emulating, but already at the age of 16 or 17, he's trying to surpass. Yeah. If you will, maybe he will borrow the theme, but metrically, he will try to do something more elaborate, more interesting. And he does this up to 1910. So Pessoa is 22. He's assigned close to 30 books to at least these two pre-heteronyms, and that is a name that we, the critics, give not Pessoa, because they came to life before the heteronyms. The heteronyms happened in 1914. So between 1910 and 1914, Pessoa stops doing the book attribution. He continues to write in English. He will send to England to one of the more prominent literary critics at the time, the Mad Fiddler. He receives a letter, crushing letter, not a good review, not excitement. And when you actually read those poems, and then you read what was being written by your Ezra Pound or your T.S. Eliot in England, you say no wonder. In a way, I don't want to be unfair because there are some solid, and more than 2, 3, 4, 5 handfuls of English poems that Pessoa eventually came to write, but he would never really send them. He would never again submit a manuscript. And that in a way made him think, okay, if I want to publish in English, it'll be, I'm going to self-publish the books. And I'm going to continue writing, but I will. And he did. He would go on to self-publish 3 chapbooks of sonnets and long poems in English. But at the same time, really write more and more Portuguese and more literary criticism and start publishing in Portuguese. In 1912 is the first piece that Pessoa publishes of literary criticism. He's 24. He's writing a lot, but publishing very, very, very slow in that process. Really calculating, because he really thought for the longest time that he would be a poet in English and perhaps in England. 1913, he creates his last, very interesting in terms of the literary heritage tradition, figure, Frederick Wyatt, after Thomas Wyatt. So the creator or the figure that brought the sonnet into England through Petrarch, Pessoa knows where to go.
if he's going to create figures, and it's not that every single one has a literary connection, but sometimes they do, and when they do, they are really connected to something very distinctive, like Chatterton and Thomas Rowley, or in this case, Frederick Wyatt and Thomas and Thomas Wyatt. So, and a year later, what does Pessoa do? He gives birth to Cairo, who will be the master of the writers that he that very year he would create. So he will no longer assign or give books to these names, but instead create the master and have the heteronyms come hang out. Cairo was, as Pessoa tells us in one of the prefaces for Cairo's complete works, ignorant of letters. He didn't know any English, so of course he had never heard of or read Whitman. And if there are any Whitman echoes in Cairo's poetry, that just happened. But Cairo's poetry certainly surpasses that of Whitman. And so we really have a crescendo what Pessoa does, and the pinnacle of the heteronyms, right, will be 1914. In 1914, the three within a month or a couple of months right before the summer of 1914, just also a very important year for the history of the Western world, right? And when you read Campos' poems and a lot of the tone, the interjections, the howling of in terms of machines, and that should resonate with what is happening. Because we may think, what this Pessoa lived in the Tower of Babel, he lived in a library, in a world of his own. What about life outside? What about life in the streets in Lisbon? What about the Iberian Peninsula? What about England? What about Europe? He created those names to write sociological pieces. He created those names to write about the war. And he also created names to write philosophical treatises and fiction. And he also, just like all of us, needed to make some money. So he also tried to. He wrote film scripts. He also wrote detective novels, and he that
like all of us.
Like all of us in the sense that he right.
It's great. I mean, it just occurs to me as you're giving us this brilliant overview that he's a sort of elaborate literary method actor, right? Who's also assigning his own reading lists to the people that he's inventing, who then go on to surpass the source material. I mean, this is like, raise your hand if you struggle finishing a single book at this point, right, with our attention. But I mean, this is, there were hands, I saw you. So this is, in some ways, my next question is, for you as a translator, what are the challenges of having to re-enter this work and possibly re-edit this work, given the scope and the density and the sources that are coming in through the language that Pessoa is creating, and again, in so many various ways, right? So formally, how are these heteronyms writing in sort of distinguishable ways, and how does that affect your role as a translator and editor?
So Pessoa, by 1914, and it'll take his entire life for the next 21 years, he will continue to write under the names of, especially Campos. Campos writes even in October of 35, when Pessoa passes away at the age of 47 and a half. Reis, he will exile him. This was a monarch. He will exile him to the problem in Portugal. He will exile Reis to Brazil. That's why Saramago then brings Reis back brilliantly in the Saramago novel. And Cairo was the master, and just like his best friend, Mario de Sacarneiro, who passed away very young, and Keats, and of course he has his references also within the biography that he gives, the three heteronyms. He invents 136 names, but with complete works of this caliber, if you will, in terms of the quality, in terms of the complexity. We have a handful, under 10. Many were one-offs, but what do you do in terms of as a translator? What Pessoa did with the three heteronyms, the influences were clear for him, and as a reader, some are very, very evident, especially if you reading, and if you have a background in British literature, you can see, feel, hear the romantics. Sometimes Campos will, for instance, mention Blake, and you may pick up on a Blakean image, with the angels. And the Walt Whitman, you will have, for instance, also a lot of anaphora, both in Caedo and Campos. Now, he was very, very careful with themes. I mean, for the three heteronyms, he assigned them a zodiac sign. He created an astrological chart for each one. So the master, his sign was Aries, and he was the fire sign. And Campos, Libra, he was an air sign. And then the more poised, the more sensible of the three, Reis was an earth sign. So now, Pessoa is slowly but very clearly, so thematically, Caedo will be the nature poet. The opposite, he will create the city poet. So there you can see the Whitman and the poetry, both of free verse, but very different free verse. Caedo more aphoristic. He's the master, so he's the sage. He's imparting wisdom on the two disciples, and Pessoa himself becomes a disciple of Caedo. So when he writes and talks about the heteronyms, he will also make sure that when he writes under the orthonym, that's a word that Pessoa coins to oppose to the heteronyms, he's also part of this coterie. The themes are different. The diction is different in each, and also the metrics. Caedo, free verse, aphoristic, short, concise, and visually the poems. Longer poems in Campos. One of the techniques that he borrows from Walt Whitman, other than anaphora that both do, but certainly more Campos, is phrasal rhythm. So in the long lines of Walt Whitman, say you would have 2 beats, half line, and then 2 beats of 3 and 3. And we encounter a lot of that in Campos. So in some of the instances, so I would scan the poem, and after Margaret did the first draft, I would go in and try to see if it would still make sense, keep the sense, but at the same time, gather and render that layer that came from Walt Whitman, that is active in the Portuguese. So Pessoa is writing through Campos in a way that the Portuguese language up to then was not really doing. So, if you will, creating patterns through phrasal rhythm. That is in English, right? Counting number of beats. In Portuguese, the driving element in metrics would be, counting syllables or placing syllables in certain positions, but not what English metrics did. So that was really fascinating to find both language from writers that the heteronyms were reading, even though Pessoa was either negating or in the paratext. Because we have a lot of Pessoa that have created translators. Pessoa created writers who would write prefaces and present these books. And of course, Pessoa wanted this in France, but not in any magazine. He wanted it in the Mercure de France, of course, in Pilon. And then same thing in England. He wanted them in certain magazines. So he was doing it in a way. There's a book in Pessoa's private library. Pessoa voraciously and annotated his books. So the marginalia, the books are an extension, if you will, of his archives. So we talk about the papers for the autograph manuscripts in Pessoa's archives or typescripts. But when we talk about the book, we're talking about the flight leaves that have annotations, sometimes poems, translations. And so this fictitious authors, in this case translators, that Pessoa is creating, he is creating it for a reason. In the library, Pessoa in one book about Walt Whitman reads that Walt Whitman was his best advertiser. When Leaves of Grass came out, he wrote anonymous reviews and sent them out right away. So Pessoa thought, he noticed that, but he thought, this is what I'm going to do. So I'm going to have people write about my work. But those works he didn't publish. Interestingly, the one that he did publish, and he published it in Portugal, it's not a good review. But it's not, and it's not in a review form. It's a poem that Campos writes. So maybe I can read.
Yes, I was about to say, can you read us some of the work you'd love to do?
It's a poem that Campos writes about a play that Pessoa wrote, because of course he was a playwright. Shakespeare being his main influence, he wrote plays both in Portuguese and English. So he wrote a static play where, influenced by Maeterlinck, the Belgian playwright, where there's no plot, just really ideas, and oftentimes 2 or 3 characters in a soliloquy or monologues. And this is what Campos writes. The title. For Fernando Pessoa, after reading his static drama, The Sailor, in Orfeo 1. Orfeo 1 was a magazine where The Sailor was published. After 12 minutes of your drama, The Sailor, in which the most agile and astute sit there sleepy and brutish, and make not a whiff of sense, one of the women keeping vigil says with Munger's magic, only the dream is eternal and beautiful. Why are we still speaking? Now, that is precisely what I was going to ask. And Campos does talk about Caído in his prose. He talks about Caído in his poetry. He also mentioned Ricardo Reis in his poetry. So you have this intertextuality within the world, both with paratexts and also in the poetry. The poets that have influence, but somehow the heteronyms, so through the heteronyms, is trying to either do a salute, Walt Whitman, thank you for everything that you've given me. This is what I am, right? So Campos, for instance, will write poems, the great odes, in a way to salute Walt Whitman, to distance himself from Walt Whitman. Nada me prende, a nada me ligo, a nada pertenço. Todas as sensações me tomam e nenhuma fica. Nothing holds me. Nothing binds me. I belong to nothing. Every sensation grips me, but none linger. I am more varied than a random multitude. I am more diverse than the spontaneous universe. All ages belong to me for a moment. All souls for a moment have their place in the flow of intuitions, a river of suppositions, but always successive waves. Always the sea, now not recognizing itself, always indefinitely divergent from the river. Which will, of course, be a leitmotif in Pessoa, also the ortónimo, the orthonym, the ocean, as a Portuguese poet. If you were to ask me, what are some images that keep returning, certainly in Campos and in Pessoa himself, we end up knowing the least from and off in terms of his writings. Even in Portugal, to this day, I checked with colleagues, we do not have the first volume of his Portuguese poetry critically edited. And so we are still transcribing documents from the 2 trunks, those 30,000 documents that Pessoa, manuscripts and typescripts that Pessoa left. That said, 10% of the 100 have signatures. This of course, we talk about the heteronyms, and this is extremely exciting, and it was Pessoa's life, through the very last month of his life. but many documents, it's true that Pessoa was the most prolific. The heteronyms wrote roughly 500 poems in Portuguese. Pessoa wrote also in English and French.
You know, this may seem sort of basic question or perhaps a very abstract one, but having lived with this and metabolized it the way you have, how do you explain this mind and this genius? I mean, what sort of insights have you gleaned just from sitting with the work and with this person and with the heteronyms and the ways that you have? What surprised you perhaps even by working on this latest project with him, since you've worked on so many?
The Chatterton, when I arrived, that fascinated. That was within the first year. I basically moved to France. I thought that I would eventually become a poet in French, and I was looking forward to falling in love with French poets, and other than Baudelaire and Rimbaud, poets that had written, not in prose poetry, but until Pessoa came into my life. When Pessoa came into my life, I just packed my bags, my debts, my suits, and I just got in a bus and went to Lisbon. And within 6 months, I fortunately received the Gulbenkian Foundation grant. I was able to survive, and I wanted to first begin in his books, not in the forest of the trunk. I didn't really know much in Paris, but I had, through Patrick Illet, Pessoa's translator in France, about the richness of, he said, if you really want to understand or even enjoy more of Pessoa, read some of the people that he read. So that is what really moved me at the age at which he was reading this authors and how closely he was reading these authors. I mean, I haven't mentioned yet, but he was not only reading, taking notes, writing criticism about this, about the writers, about Shakespeare, about Milton, about the Romantics, but also translating some of them.
That makes sense.
And no,
them again. Yeah.
and this, in a way, was his first step towards Portuguese from the English, right? And he's doing this at the age of 12, 14, 15. So, if you will, the caliber of names and the amount, and also the quantity. Once I went into the trunk, how prolific he was, and he was a man that really kept his paper. So for several poems, you find a first draft, a second draft, a third draft, which of course then for the critical editions, that's why it's taken so long. You have to decipher the handwriting, and oftentimes, sometimes even the first document in the Pessoa archive, as Geronimo says in this wonderful, eloquent book, an introductory book to Pessoa's work, the co-editor of Campos, of Campos's book, he notices how the first document says, this document could either be for the Book of the Squire, for Álvaro de Campos, or for something else that I haven't figured out yet. So every now and then, even Pessoa did not know who this should be for. Especially the Book of the Squire, because the Book of the Squire had three writers, Vicente Guedes, the first phase, and then Bernardo Soares, and then sort of Pessoa, and that was a semi-heteronym, because Pessoa says, they write like me. The prose is really pretty much like mine. Bernardo Soares says, however, when he writes is when I'm tired, when I'm drowsy, but also when my inhibition has been suspended, when my way of thinking, my logic has been suspended, then we can infer maybe when we're drinking. Possible. So a lot of the Book of the Squire, it is Pessoa through, if you will, that filter. But yeah, the theory really after the practice. So we write all of this, and only 1928, at the age of 40, will he come up with the terms heteronymism. The heteronymus, obras heterónimas. He doesn't even say the heteronym as a noun. He describes it as an adjective, right? Which is a sort of a type of thinking, a type of word, which is very, very interesting. And
wonderful, absolutely wonderful. I think should we open it up to questions from the audience? Yeah. Maybe let's give you a round of applause. more than happy to.
Just wondering, what's lost in translation, what's untranslatable?
I can think of what's gained. So much to be gained for the readers out in the world, for Pessoa, for his legacy, for us translators, tools for our own poetry. So much can be gained, and on and on and on and on. Friends, people, cultures, trips. What's lost? It's so hard. I more and more don't see what's lost. It's a new book. This is authored by, without any pretension, by Margaret herself, and also those poets who Pessoa read, and we are slowly finding. I was sharing with Maya before the conversation that when we translated with Margaret the Caído, there was one word that initially had been translated for the verb saudar or saudação, which is a greeting, right, or bidden farewell if you're departing. And but it's when you know Pessoa and you know the influence and you know that Walt Whitman, right, has that this salute poem and it's a word that comes up a few times in his poetry. So we know, and what we ended up doing, of course, was using a word that initially we did not think of, but because of that connection, because of the archival connection, that was gained in translation, and by gaining that, we also brought the influence that otherwise would have been lost, and perhaps even not lost, but silent in Portuguese, for those who don't know, and it's more apparent in English. But it's interesting that through the English, the ghost or the presences are maybe more present, because Pessoa was really a writer in Portuguese, but almost you would think of a British poet who moved to Portugal in a way that also that read widely in French and was very interested in what he could not read in German. He read in French, and sometimes he could not read in Italian, or he also got it in Italian, but also in French and English. And then he had friends. So his Portuguese books are mostly books that were given by younger poets who wanted to be read by Pessoa. He was not really buying a lot of Portuguese books. He kept his entire life ordering books from England. He remained, and he was invited at some point to go to England. He declined that offer, just to close, and what's gained, what's lost, I don't know. In the Blake, we have a beautiful image in Campos, where Campos talks about the contiguity. He said, "A contiguidade dos anjos." So this, and we know that Blake could see had these visions right early in life, and they appear very much. In fact, the opening of the marriage of heaven and hell, we have the voice of an angel speaking, and we have the word the company, the companion. So we thought with Margaret, maybe companionship, it's a way to bring back this Blake image, because the line begins with Blake. Like Blake, I want to be in the contiguity of angels, would have been the literal translation of the Campos, and we went for in the companionship of angels. So both what's gained, what's lost, the Portuguese music, perhaps because you cannot render some music, but some you can. Yes.
I have two questions. Can you talk a little bit about the process of translating with the collaborator, and how opening up that dialogue between you and Pessoa to include Margaret and vice versa, how that worked on a literal level? And two, I think also the metatextuality and hypertextuality of Pessoa presages like the malleability of digital identity. And how does it feel to read him and translate him now in 2023?
To collaborate with Margaret is wonderful. I am very privileged to be working with someone who's been translating for decades. I could not be happier. It's a gift. It's a gift. I really thought that after leaving Portugal, it's so hard to leave Pessoa, but I thought I was sort of done. I came to the US with a few projects and books that I was going to, I ended up publishing in Portugal in the original, maybe a book of essays here in English, but I wasn't thinking about translating Pessoa. So it's been a gift to translate Pessoa with someone who is so professional, so kind, eloquent, and I believe, I hadn't really thought about this until this week, that it's great that we have someone. Margaret is British, she's in England, we are here in the US, and we are trying to, whenever there's something that's too British, we bring it with Declan here into American English, but I'm sure that every now and then there's something that may feel a little British. And that is the best of both worlds. It should be like that. If it had been only an American translator or me with an American, we wouldn't have had that. And this is a better product because of that. Mm-hmm. Because those were the writers for Pessoa for his whole life, mm-hmm. right? So I cannot be happier. Margaret really, she does the first draft, and then I go in with the papers, with the library, and with the metrics, and basically with the diction. And if I know that what I call the talismanic words, then I really try to tweak. And she for the most part very, very open to moments. I mean, the Blake and the Whitman with Caedo are really wonderful moments that we end up then even writing about as translators. But every collaboration is different. I translate from other languages into other languages with other folks, and every translation with my mom is different. With Forrest Gander was different, and I advise my students, if anything, do it at least once. Co-translate at least once. Don't just think that this is a solitary practice. You have enough solitude as a writer. We translate because we are writers. That's why we, for the most part, translate. I know that is in my case, in the case of many people that I know, and somewhat deep inside and hidden, Margaret, of course, is a writer too. So every collaboration is different. With her, of course, it's remotely. She is in England. Now, for your second question, Pessoa and reading Pessoa in 23 today, I mean, if you want to then reframe, or maybe someone will re-ask in terms of the digital humanities or the digital world, but the multiplicity of names. I mean, one of the courses that I've been building slowly is a course that will be called something like guises, masks, pseudonyms, heteronyms, and sort of bring in different traditions, mainly the British, right, that the Pessoa made in, and how these authors were able to self-other their voices. And because Pessoa had these references. Another reference that I didn't mention was Robert Browning, right? Victorian, very celebrated in 1850s and 60s with his dramatic monologue. So of course Pessoa had him, but of course Pessoa was not going to do that. He was not going to write poems that had certain voices, but he was actually going to create the what he calls, in one line he says, Álvaro de Campos é uma personagem, mas o que falta é a peça. He is a character in a play, but what's missing is the play. So he does have his references. And of course, for the 21st century today, I mean, for us to be given someone who takes the freedom to write under different nationalities, different ages, different backgrounds. I mean, Caedo is ignorant of letters. He lives with his aunts in north of Lisbon. Then a dropout engineer who went to the east to smoke opium, but then meets Caedo and writes completely different poetry. There's a before Campos and an after Campos, right? Because Caedo really is that thunderbolt, as Heracles said, that steers all things. It's really that eureka moment. So it is just very, it's liberating. He also wrote under, I mean, we haven't talked about this, but under female writers. And the last character that Pessoa created, and this is very telling, Because had Pessoa lived longer, I believe that he would have more and more. In 1929, number 136 writes a love letter unlike anything Pessoa ever wrote. Pessoa wrote many love letters to his girlfriend, nothing like this. No love poem that Cairo wrote love poems when he was sick. Nothing like this. The love letter that Maria José writes has been staged in Portugal numerous times. It's unlike anything. It is extremely sensual, and it is written in the voice of this middle-aged woman who is a hunchback, and she's in love with Fernando Antonio Pessoa. But it's sort of this figure, like this man who she is afraid of, talking to, and it's sort of this language that we can only perhaps find in as far as the emotions in Campos, but contained in the sense that not about the love of so that was sort of also like a swan song. Which is a really beautiful piece that. So in the 21st century, it makes sense. I mean, Pessoa right now are all these names and nationalities as well, like French, Portuguese, English.
Maybe one more question.
For this volume, did you work with existing poems that were known and had been published already, or did you go into the trunk, so to speak, and find new things?
So for the Cairo, the master, Geronimo Pizarro, was one of the foremost Pessoa editors in the world today. He's from Colombia. We coincided in Lisbon for a decade, now back in Colombia. We did go in the trunk and we looked at every existing previous edition, and we had to go through the 30,000 documents because when the estate was acquired, then it was divided, put in different places. But oftentimes Pessoa would write on one side a Campos piece and then on the other a Cairo. So you can only put this in one box. So whenever you do any Pessoa edition, you have to look at the 30,000 documents. I did the film scripts. There are only 30 papers, but I had to look again at the 30,000. Because when I was looking at the Cairo, I was not looking at that. Or when I was looking at one project, I did not have that in mind. So you have to start from the very beginning. For the Campos, Geronimo and Antonio Cardiello, they looked at every single existing edition prior to this one and every single one of the 30,000 documents. And then for every poem, if there were multiple drafts, they took the last variant, and that is what Tinta da China, the critical editions in Portugal, do. And then what we are doing here with New Directions is, for the first time, we have not only a complete heteronym, but based on the source of the critical edition. So we know that we are working with the most up-to-date, faithful source text.
So there were new things.
There were, we published new things in English for sure, because the Campos that Tinta da China published a few years ago was not the Campos, say, that was published 15, 20 years ago. But this is the first, there wasn't even an attempt before for a complete Campos. So both have the prose and the poetry. And whatever we couldn't put here, because Campos was the most prolific of the three heteronyms, we put on the New Directions website for free with a lot of facsimiles. So you can also peruse and see a lot of the poetry that we wanted. Also, the drafts, the poems that were unfinished, we wanted to also offer that. Sort of at the tail of the comment, because Pessoa himself, he did publish some poems by each one. Cairo the Master came last in 1925. So born in 1914, born in the Pessoa Galaxy, but published 11 years later. This is the one that he was probably the closest to in terms of. Cairo was the master, but in a resume, the first heteronym that Pessoa mentions is Campos. And the first heteronym that Pessoa published in his lifetime was Campos. A year after he was born, in 1950, in that Orfeo magazine. It was a very magazine publishing new poets and a lot of experimental poetry and incendiary at the time.
Thank you so, so much. This
Thank
is
you,
absolutely-